Hello, let's talk about cardio today. So, talking about our aerobic fitness, also known as our cardiorespiratory endurance. So, the definition of cardiorespiratory endurance is the ability to perform large muscle, whole body exercise at a moderate to high intensity for extended periods of time. An alternative definition is the ability of the heart and lungs to deliver oxygen to the body's tissues during sustained physical activity. This can also be known as the ability to exercise or play for extended periods of time without getting tired. But this is basically our stamina. How long can we keep going without becoming fatigued? Another important definition that is important to know is something called aerobic capacity, also known as our VO2 max or our maximal oxygen consumption. Those terms can be used interchangeably. But this is our body's ability to provide oxygen to the working skeletal muscles during exercise. And you can see in this figure here, we have a young lady. She is connected to a gas mask, which is connected to a computer. That computer is connected to some gas analyzers and some software. So she's going to run on the treadmill, and that software, those gas analyzers, are going to be able to identify how much oxygen she's consuming and how much carbon dioxide she's exhaling. And with this VO2 max test, we can actually determine what her current cardiovascular endurance level is by having those gas analyzers kind of see how much oxygen she's taking in. The more oxygen she can take in, the more cardiovascularly fit she is. So in order to increase our cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory endurance level, we're going to have to participate in some activity. So just as a refresher, we have our physical activity, which we have discussed in a lot of detail. But this is any activity, any movement that provides an increase in energy expenditure. So this can be, maybe doing some gardening, brushing your hair, brushing your teeth, walking to the mailbox around the block near your home. And then we have our aerobic activity. So these activities are done more continuously and for the specific reason of increasing or maintaining our current cardiovascular fitness level. And again, these activities use oxygen to produce energy for body movement. And then finally, we have something called anaerobic activity. And the word anaerobic literally means without oxygen. And our anaerobic activities are activities that are completed in short bursts. These short bursts can be of moderate or high intensity. And when we perform these short bursts of these intense activities, this is going to require energy that is in limited supply. Our body has 3 different energy systems that we use in order to create energy for our body during exercise. And there are 2 specifically that our body uses that can only provide a little bit of energy for these high intense activities. So all of the activities on the previous slide are going to have an effect on our cardiorespiratory endurance level. And really quickly, I just want to talk about the importance of cardiorespiratory endurance exercise. Physiologically, it's going to lead to a healthier and stronger heart. It's going to lead to healthier blood vessels, which will lead to lower blood pressure. Participating in regular cardiorespiratory endurance exercise can also lower our LDL cholesterol, also known as our bad cholesterol, and it can raise our HDL or healthy cholesterol. And cardiorespiratory endurance exercise is actually one of the most important indicators of good health. Researchers have identified a link between cardiorespiratory endurance and health outcomes in adults. And for kids and adolescents, cardiorespiratory endurance exercise is related to their obesity level, their blood pressure, and their insulin sensitivity. Also, performing aerobic or cardio activities have shown a positive role when it comes to an individual's mood and self-esteem level. So when we teach cardiorespiratory endurance exercise in the physical education setting, we want to make sure before we get started that we check with parents to see if their students have any medical conditions before starting off with any physical activity program. And so when I talk about specific medical conditions, making sure that the child is free of heart conditions. If the child has asthma, making sure that the child has an inhaler that is available to be with them during that physical education session, or if the child is diabetic, making sure that the student goes to the nurse beforehand and checks their blood sugar levels before they participate in exercise. Making sure that we teach cardiorespiratory endurance concepts to students of all ages, because students that are in kindergarten, they are capable of grasping concepts such as, knowing the feeling of increased respiration or increased heart rate when they start to move. So we can even start them off as early as kindergarten when it comes to cardiorespiratory endurance. And then one thing to keep in mind is that our cardiorespiratory endurance tests, such as the 1 mile run, a 12-minute run, or a pacer test, may not be representative of a student's current physical activity level, because when it comes to those specific cardiorespiratory endurance tests, usually students that already engage in that type of conditioning on a regular basis, they are going to have higher scores than students that don't participate in that sort of conditioning for, let's say an outside sport. And then, of course, making sure that we provide plenty of opportunities, giving them a variety of opportunities, and hopefully they find something that they find, fun and enjoyable, and something that they'll look forward to participating in the future. Okay, moving on to the principles of exercise and cardiorespiratory endurance. So I know you see that big red stop sign there, but we'll get to that in a moment. So first, talking about specificity. We need to make sure that our students are participating in activities that are specific. So they must be cardiorespiratory endurance activity. We want to make sure that our kids are training the way that we want them to change. So they must be doing some type of cardio activity, whether it's running or jogging or swimming or cycling. We want to make sure that we're staying away from having them do something like push-ups, because while push-ups are excellent for muscular fitness, they're not going to do much for our cardiorespiratory endurance level. Okay, and then we have progression and overload. So we want to make sure that we are adjusting the frequency, the intensity, and time of an activity. And the student must be able to do more of the activity than previously in order to elicit that training adaptation that we're looking for. Okay, moving on, talking about regularity. So making sure that that student is participating in this activity at least a minimum of 3 times per week. Anywhere from 3 to 5 times per week is ideal, but a minimum of 3. They have to participate in this activity on a regular basis in order to improve. And then as far as individuality goes, the thing that we're looking for here is they find something that they truly enjoy, something that they look forward to doing, something that we can help them build up that intrinsic motivation. Okay, so this table 5.2, is directly from the textbook, and this is just showing the FIT principle, so the guidelines that are applied to cardiorespiratory endurance. So you can see the different columns. We have children 5 to 12 years old, adolescents 11 years of age and older, and then we have our middle school and our high school youth that participate in some sort of sport or outside athletics. And we can see what the frequency is, the intensity, and the next slide we have the time and the type for all of those age groups. I'm not going to go over this too much here, but I'm going to let you all take a look at that on your own time. So moving on to intensity monitoring. So when we're performing cardiorespiratory endurance, or actually when we're performing any sort of exercise, we want to make sure that we are monitoring the intensity. So there are a few different ways to monitor the intensity. The first is with heart rate. So we can have a student take their pulse, whether we're having them taking it on their wrist or on their neck. And in order to figure out, how many beats per minute we're looking for, we can have them calculate their maximal heart rate or heart rate reserve beforehand. And then we have rating of perceived exertion, also known as RPE, and there are two different scales for rating of perceived exertion. We have a 1 to 10 scale, and the 1 to 10 scale, this is, 1 being something that you can do for hours on end, 10 being something that this is super exhausting and I need to stop right now. And ideally, we want our kids to be at a 4 to a 6. 4 to a 6 is a moderate intensity. And then for our Borg scale of perceived exertion, this is a 6 to 20 scale. This is not something we would have children use. If anything, we would have probably our high schoolers use something like this. And again, that is a 6 to 20 scale, and I will show you what that looks like on one of the next slides coming up. And then something that we've already talked about in class, one of the easiest ways to monitor our intensity is with the talk test. So being able to maintain a conversation with somebody that's walking right beside you, that is the perfect intensity. We're at moderate intensity if we can maintain a conversation with our buddy. And then finally, we have something called the Omni scale of perceived exertion, and this is a visual scale. So this is something that we could have printed out, maybe have a hard copy, have a few of those hard copies floating around in class, especially for our younger kids. Having this visual scale with pictures depicting what fatigue looks like, because when it comes to kids participating in activity, they're not going to be able to let you know how hard an activity feels. That's something that they can't quite grasp yet, but for kids, they will be able to understand, how tired they feel. So if you show them this scale, and I'll show you in a moment here what that scale looks like, and they can be able to see what that fatigue starts to look like as the exercise intensity starts to increase. Okay, so let's just take a step back here. I wanted to talk about heart rate really quickly. So for heart rate, this is something that you can teach younger kids how to do, but we're not going to have them take their pulse along their neck or on their wrist. If we're having them take their pulse, that's something more so for middle school and high school students. But for our elementary school students, we can start teaching them those cardiorespiratory endurance concepts. And we can have them put their hand on their chest over their heart, and we can have them feel their heartbeat. You can ask them, how does your heart feel? Is your heart beating really fast? Do you feel that flub dub after we just finished, that quick run around the field? And for our older students, I'm sure most of you have done this in the past, in high school, definitely. We can have them feel for their pulse along their carotid artery, that is along their neck, or along their radial artery, that is right below the base of your thumb on your wrist. Something that I want you all to be aware of is that if you have them feel around for their carotid pulse, the pulse on their neck, just make sure that if they're having a really hard time trying to find that, you let them know that they should switch over and try to find the pulse along their wrist. Because if they're there kind of just manipulating their neck and just pushing around, that is actually called carotid massage, and that will actually decrease their pulse. So that's something that we don't want. So if they're having some trouble, just let them know and have them try to find it along their wrist, try to find their radial artery. So we have them feel for their pulse because we want them to be within a specific target heart rate zone. And this specific target heart rate zone is an indicator of our exercise intensity. And we can determine what that zone is with a couple of different ways. We have a couple of different formulas that we could use, whether we're using our maximal heart rate method or the Carbonin method. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But just note that for kids ages 6 to 14, it is not recommended to use heart rate for intensity because kids actually have really high heart rates, and as they start to get older, their heart rate starts to slow down. So after the age of 14, then we can go ahead and start using that maximal heart rate method or that Carbonin method. But until then, we can have them use that 1 to 10 scale for RPE, or even show them those visual pictures with the Omni scale. Or the talk test. The talk test we can use for all ages. So this is what that maximal heart rate formula looks like. It's 220 minus their age. So we have our example up here on the slide. Our student is 17 years old, so they would do 220 minus 17. So their max heart rate would be 203 beats per minute. And then we have the Carbonin method, also known as heart rate reserve. So their heart rate reserve is their target heart rate is going to equal their max heart rate minus their resting heart rate times the training intensity that they want to work at plus their resting heart rate. We're going to add that back into the equation. And on the left side of the screen, we can see how we can calculate our max heart rate. So we can use that max heart rate formula, or maybe we've had that athlete take a VO2 max test. Usually these VO2 max tests are done in a laboratory setting, and they probably won't be available unless that student is associated with some sort of prestigious outside athletic club. So usually we're going to revert back to that 220 minus their age. Their resting heart rate, so resting heart rate can be acquired immediately after somebody wakes up. So you can take your pulse while you're lying in bed, or if that student has a smartwatch or some type of fitness device, they can even take it directly from there because they have a lot of data available to them, and they can just see what their resting heart rate was the night before. And the training percentage, like I said previously, this is how hard that student is aiming to work during the activity. So these are the training intensities for heart rate reserve. Less than 30%, very light, and then you can see as that starts to increase, and then greater than or equal to 90% would either be, we're near maximal or very close to their maximal heart rate. So this is something that you can actually print out and have available for students, a little chart, heart rate based on a 10-second count, because we don't want to have them wasting time trying to count their pulse for an entire minute. So what we can do is we can have them count for 10 seconds, and whatever their beat count was for that 10 seconds, let's say it was 11 beats in 10 seconds, we would just look across the chart and we can see that their heart rate is currently at 66 beats per minute. Okay, moving on, talking about rating of perceived exertion, RPE, specifically that 1 to 10 scale. So like I mentioned previously, a 1, you are relaxing, you're doing very light activity, something that you can do for hours on end. And then a 10, I am absolutely exhausted. I can only do this for maybe a couple more seconds before I need to stop. And so we want to be somewhere right in between, anywhere from a 4 to a 6, that moderate activity. Okay, and this is the Borg scale of perceived exertion. That is that 6 to 20 scale. So we could use this with high schoolers, and this is actually frequently seen for laboratory testing as well. If you have charts like this that are handy, you can print a bunch of them out and have them posted at different stations, so students can go ahead and write down what their rating of perceived exertion was for that exercise bout that was completed in class. So a 6 would be no exertion whatsoever. You are sitting on the couch watching Netflix. And as you can see, as the numbers start to increase, so does the level of intensity, the level of exertion. And by the time we reach 20, that is maximal exertion. You can only sustain that for a couple of seconds. And we want to be anywhere from a 12 to a 16. So this exercise should be, somewhat hard to hard. It should be a little challenging. Okay, so the Omni scale of RPE, I've mentioned that previously, and I have a picture of that on the next slide, so we'll show you that in a moment. And then I have the talk test. So, if you're exercising with a buddy or a group of individuals, you should be able to maintain a conversation with them. And this is what the Omni scale of RPE looks like. So the one at the top is actually for adults. And for adults, they can gauge intensity in terms of, if it feels easy or if it feels somewhat hard or extremely hard. But for children, like I said previously, children won't understand what hard exercise feels like yet. For them, they're going to be going off of how fatigued or how tired they feel. So a 0 would be, or a 1 would be, I'm not tired at all. 2, a little bit tired, all the way up to a 9, I'm getting very, very tired. So based on, you can even get Omni scales of RPE that are a little bit more descriptive, where we have pictures at every single number, showing in more detail what that fatigue will look like at each of those numbers. Okay. Let's talk about different types of training. So we have 2 different classes of training for aerobic activity. We have continuous training and interval training. And then within those categories, we have a couple of specific types of training activities that we can participate in. Okay, so the first is continuous training. And this is movement that lasts several minutes without rest period, so it is literally continuous. So we can have moderate continuous activity and vigorous continuous activity. And it is not recommended that children ages 6 to 12 years old participate in vigorous continuous activity. That is something that is a little too much for them, so we want to make sure that they are participating only in moderate continuous activity. And as far as continuous moderate activity goes, I have just little time frames for you all to kind of abide by depending on what grade you're going to be working with. So kindergartners all the way up to about 2nd or 3rd grade can only perform about 3 to 5 minutes of continuous activity before they need to stop. So we would have them perform something, an activity, maybe, some running or skipping or jumping around continuously for 3 minutes, have them stop, maybe do something else in the meantime, and then they can go back and perform another bout of 3 to 5 minutes. And as students get older, we can see that they can perform more continuous activity without rest. Okay. So talking about something called fartlek training. So fartlek is a Swedish word that means speed play. And we are literally manipulating the speed of what type of activity that we're doing in that continuous bout of exercise. So I have a little picture here where you can see that, the first minute they're running at a 5K pace. If any of you have ever run a 5K or a 10K, half marathon or a marathon, you'll know that the pace that you need to keep for all of those races is very different. So 5K, we can be running really, really fast. And if we look over at the second minute, they're at a 10K pace, and they're gonna slow that down a little bit because now the race is a little bit longer, and we need to pace ourselves. And then for the third minute, that's our half marathon pace. So race has gotten even longer and we need to slow down even more. And we are literally going to be, manipulating and playing with the speed throughout that entire workout. So I have an example of something that you can do for class if you wanted to set up a sort of an obstacle course. So we have our start up on the top left, where we can have them walk, jog, sprint, and then continue that format for that specific obstacle course. And depending on how long the course is, we can have them repeat that only once, maybe even twice, again, depending on the length of the course. And this is a really excellent example of fartlek training because they are literally manipulating their speed throughout the entire training session. We can even make this a little bit more fun and a little bit more exciting. We can actually use fartlek training in sort of an obstacle course with fundamental movement skills. So we can have them start off at the top left. We can have them walk, maybe run pretty fast, walk, and then from there, we can give them another option. They can either walk or run to the hopscotch station, so they'll practice their hopping. And then we can have them run in between the hopscotch station to the frog jump station. So we can have them practice jumping on 2 feet. In between the frog jump station and the leaping station, we can have them run fast. We can maybe have them leap to different targets on the ground. And then we can even have them practice another fundamental movement skill when they get to the next station. We can actually have them gallop to the sliding station. After they've completed the sliding station, having them walk and then running really fast to the finish line. And there are lots of different things we can do, many different manipulations we can make to make this different, or even to make this a little bit more difficult as well. Okay, moving on to interval training. So interval training, also known as high intensity interval training or HIIT. This is short bursts of high intensity activities followed by a period of lower level activity such as walking or light jogging. And there are many different types of high intensity interval activities, performing something that, maybe we are performing really intense sprinting for 15 seconds, and then we are going to walk for about 30 seconds, and then we're going to flip-flop between that high intense activity and that low intensity activity for a specific period of time. Okay, then we have something called a Tabata, and a Tabata is 20 seconds of work followed by 10 seconds of rest. You would perform that for 8 cycles. So 8 cycles of the 20 seconds followed by the 10 seconds. And when you do that completely, 8 cycles equals 1 round of Tabata, and 1 total round of Tabata is 4 minutes long. Let me tell you, if you have ever completed a Tabata, it's the longest 4 minutes of your life right there. On the right side of the screen, I have a sample Tabata workout that I pulled off of Google just to show you all an example. Doing something, squat jumps for 20 seconds, rest. The rest really isn't a complete rest. It's more like a transition period, especially if you're performing different movements within that Tabata session. And ideally, we would like students or individuals in general to be able to work up to be able to perform multiple Tabata sessions in one exercise session. So being able to perform one Tabata completely, maybe resting for a couple of minutes, performing another one. Depending on the age of the student, I probably would only recommend this for middle schoolers and definitely for high schoolers. Elementary schoolers are probably a little too young to be doing something that is of this intensity. And then we have circuit training. So circuit training is another type of interval training, but it can also be continuous depending on if we are taking absolutely no rest in between the stations. then the circuit training would be continuous training. Or if we are taking breaks before we go to the next station, that is going to be interval training. I am personally a very big fan of circuit training. I think it's excellent, especially in the school setting, because we can have many students start off at different stations, and there's no waiting around, and we can just have them move in that circular fashion to get through all of the stations that day. Okay, moving on, talking about aerobic safety. So like I've mentioned previously, making sure that the students warm up properly. I recommend having them perform a group warm-up together while you, the instructor, lead them through that. After they finish the activity or the conditioning phase, having them all come together and having you, the instructor, lead them through that cool down. And then there, having them perform static stretches for their cool down as well. Making sure that we're providing appropriate activities for the group of students that we're working with, as well as appropriate intensities. Like I mentioned previously, we shouldn't have students, 6 to 12 years old that are performing extremely vigorous exercise. And then for all ages, we need to make sure that we're providing plenty of water breaks, providing water before, during, and after the activity. If possible, try to avoid very hot and humid weather conditions. If you can, if you have the space, try to move the activity session inside if possible. And if a student is having trouble with an activity, we can modify the activities as needed. So, maybe we have a student that's having a hard time keeping up running during the entire, let's say we're doing interval training that day. Maybe we're doing some fartlek training. So if they're having trouble running or keeping up the pace for that run as fast as you can, maybe we can have them jog that session and then have them walk for the lighter intensity portion of that fartlek training. Okay, continuing with aerobic safety, we want to make sure that, just to reiterate, that we're giving kids those frequent rest breaks and those frequent water breaks. Those are especially important for younger students because children, they fatigue sooner than adults. They sweat less than adults, and they tend to hyperventilate more during exercise compared to adults. And this is because physiologically, children are smaller. They have smaller body surface areas, so they have a harder time dissipating that heat. They have smaller hearts and smaller lungs, so they need to breathe more frequently in order to get more oxygen throughout their entire body, specifically to those working skeletal muscles. So again, very, very important that we give them those frequent rest breaks and water breaks when they need them. Okay, really quickly, I wanted to talk about aerobic fitness assessment, how we test for somebody's current cardiovascular fitness level. So the first, one of the best tests is that laboratory test that I mentioned at the beginning of the slide set, that VO2 max, or that maximal oxygen consumption test. And we can see the gentleman in the green shirt, he looks like he's running pretty fast on that treadmill there. And that is the best measurement of cardiorespiratory endurance. But this test is very expensive. You need a trained test administrator. It's going to cost some money, so that's not ideal in a classroom situation. So what we're going to do for the classroom is we're going to perform field tests. Field tests are inexpensive, and we can test multiple students at once. So these tests include the mile run, the pacer test, the 12-minute run, and the 1.5-mile run. So the mile run, we're having them run 1 mile for time, seeing how quickly they can complete that 1-mile run. And then we have the pacer test. And the pacer test is, we're having them run back and forth and touch their foot to align These lines are, I believe, 20 meters apart. I'm going to have you watch a video on the pacer test in a moment here. Then we have the 12-minute run and the 1.5-mile run, and these are usually reserved for older students, high schoolers, how much distance they can cover in 12 minutes. If they can cover a longer distance in that 12 minutes, that means that they have a higher level of cardiorespiratory endurance. And then for the 1.5-mile run, we're trying to see how quickly they can run 1.5 miles. Okay, so we're going to go and watch the pacer test in a moment here, but I would like to note that in the video, the person that is narrating the video is going to state that a warm-up is not necessary due to the progressive nature of that test. I completely disagree with that statement. This is a very intense test, and a warm-up is definitely required before we have students complete that pacer. So let me pull up the video and we'll watch that just in a moment here.
PACER stands for Progressive Aerobic Cardiovascular Endurance Run. The PACER is one of the test options for estimating aerobic capacity in the FitnessGram. The PACER is a valid and fun option for estimating aerobic capacity. The objective of PACER is for the student to run as long as possible back and forth across a 20-meter distance and at a specified pace that gets faster each minute. The warm-up is not as essential for the PACER as it is for the other test of aerobic capacity because the progressive nature of the test provides a built-in warm-up. Remember, the goals of the warm-up are to prepare the body for the activity, improve performance, and reduce injuries. Prior to the beginning of the PACER, the examiner ensures that each student has a partner. The role of the partners is to help keep track of the number of form breaks. The students line up at the start line, and the partners stand behind the opposite lines. The examiner stands on the sideline with a clipboard and a score recording sheet. The examiner monitors and records the number of laps each student completes. In the PACER, one lap is the 20 or 15-meter distance from one end of the course to the other. The recorded score is the total number of laps completed by the student before the second form break. A form break occurs when the student does not touch the line by the sound of the beep. The PACER CD is set to music. The CD includes a 5-second countdown and tells the students when to start. Students begin the test running across the distance and touching the line with their foot before the sound of the beep. Walking is allowed so long as the desired pace is maintained. At the sound of the beep, students run back to the other end. A student who touches the line on the sound of the beep must immediately turn and run back to the other end. A single beep sounds at the end of each lap. The audio CD also provides a verbal cue to track the number of laps completed. A triple beep sounds at the end of each minute. The triple beep serves the same function as a single beep, but it also alerts the students that the pace will get faster.
28. 29. 30.
The first time a student cannot reach the line when the beep sounds, the student should immediately turn around and run in the opposite direction upon the sound of the beep.
28.
This is considered the first form break. The examiner, with help from the partner, takes note the first time the student fails to reach the line at the sound of the beep. The student immediately turns around and continues the pacer, as he is given one more attempt to regain the pace and reach the line before the next beep. The second time a student cannot reach the line by the beep, this is the second form break, and the test is complete. The two misses, or form breaks, do not need to be consecutive. The recorded score is the total number of laps completed by the student. The first form break is counted as a complete lap. The second form break, however, is not counted as. If the lap score is within or exceeds the range of the healthy fitness zone for the student's gender and age, the student meets the performance standard and should continue doing regular physical activity. If the score falls below the range of the healthy fitness zone, this indicates the student would benefit from physical activities designed to improve aerobic capacity. This video was developed to help ensure the pacer is.
My apologies, the video cut off there at the end. But basically, the PACER test is used a part of the fitnessgram in order to determine a student's cardiorespiratory endurance level. If there are any questions about this lecture or the previous lecture, make sure that you post your questions in the discussion section on Canvas.